computer is working. Okay, congratulations to the computer. It gave me problems earlier today, but now it's working. Good evening to everyone. Technically late afternoon by Jewish standards at least. We are picking up where we left off. We are in the middle of chapter 5 of Masechet Ketubot. And so that means we'll be picking up at chapter 5, Mishnah 5. Now we're continuing our discussion about some of the mutual obligations. You may remember that we talked a little bit last week when we were on 4.4 about whether the things that the wife made while the husband was or wasn't supporting her, whether they belonged to her to be able to support herself, or whether because he was supporting her that it was family property. Now we're going to get into more detail of exactly what sort of expectations there are about what she'll be doing. We're going to talk about the husband's requirements as well later, so don't worry, he is not off the hook. But for 5.5, we're going to be talking about the work that is considered to be normative, the normal expected workload for a woman in the ancient world. Everyone with me? Okay, so our pattern has always been that we go around the table, each person taking a Mishnah to read out loud. That way I get a different person to interrupt each time. But you're all welcome to say pass if you don't want to read out loud in public. That's perfectly fine. So the ball goes to you. You can pass or you can start reading. We pick up exactly where it says Mishnah 5 and then that little number 1.
The following are the kinds of work which a woman must perform for her husband. Okay,
wait, you got to slow down because otherwise I don't have time to interrupt. See, when I interrupt, I call it teaching, and then it's okay. But if I wasn't teaching, it'd be just rude. So why did we say that these are the types of work which a woman must perform from her husband? What is this reminding us about the economic structure of the ancient world?
She was in care of the house. She would make the house work.
It's not a question of making the house work, because that making the house work was a community activity, meaning all of the members of the family work together to make the household work. But what I'm pointing out here is that in the ancient world, the primary unit of wealth was land. Right? You had a block of land, and somewhere on that land, or maybe in the village, you'd have your house, and didn't really look like that because houses were pretty much just blocks and they were not very comfortable, certainly not by today's standards. And the land was owned by the husband. Right? That's a man. And the husband owned the land because his father had owned the land and he had inherited it from his father. And his father owned it because his father had inherited the land, and then so on and so forth, all the way back till the division of the land by Joshua, or at some point, the land came into the permanent possession of the male line. And it was the male line because that was the tribal line. Right? The reason why the Kohanim, the priests, are descended from their fathers is because tribal identity was always passed down by the father. And that tribal identity went with the land property, and that made sure that each of the tribes always maintained a fair ratio of the land. So no one tribe could over-dominate the entire nation. If you allowed the tribal lands to be randomly redistributed every so often, then you wouldn't end up with a fair and equitable distribution. Remembering in the Torah, it talks even about the Jubilee restoration of the land, that it would all go back to the beginning. Right? Every so often, you put all the pieces back in the Monopoly box, and then everyone gets dealt out the starting cash again, and you start playing all over again. And that was necessary then for the land to be attached to the tribe from which the person would come, so that it would be returned to that tribe whenever it was needed. Everyone following that? Okay, now if 99% of your wealth is based in the land, then that means most of the things you're producing, whether they be, that's grain, right? Or whether it be some form of various animals, that's a cow, or sheep or goats or anything else that you might be doing, is based upon the land, right? It needs the land, it uses the land. That's the way the community, the family is generating what they need in order to eat, to clothe themselves, and maintain their lives. That's the reason why we call it livelihood. But if all of that is dependent upon the land, then that means all the wealth generated from that is going to the owner of the land, which is the male household head, the head of the household. Following the economics so far? Right. Nowhere in the Torah does this say this is how you must organize your societies. Once the distribution of the land was broken by the conquest of the Babylonians, we don't have tribal allocations anymore. We don't have a requirement to be in this particular pattern of economics. Now, for most of the last 2,000 years, we did, because if you lived in the Middle East or if you lived in Christian Europe, this was still roughly the same model that was used all the way up until the very beginning of the modern era. Modern era, we cancel this model out. Most people's property is not based upon land, but is based upon their own ability to contribute value to labor, and that is then compensated by some form of payment. Welcome to the Industrial Revolution. So that began earlier, but that was where it really reached the tipping point where most people were generating their own income from themselves rather than generating it from the land. We don't want to go too much into the social economics of all of this, but it's important to understand, because otherwise it sounds kind of petty that she's working for him. No, what she is doing, the wife, that's a woman, right? She is taking the land, the products of the land, and she is generating out of that value, and that value is owned by the husband, but it is for the good of the household. Right? So it is reinvested, if you will, back into the life of everybody there. Does that make sense? So she's not making something and giving it to him for free. She is obligated, as we're going to see in this list, to do the following labors in order that she is also contributing to the welfare of the house. That makes sense? Okay. So what are the things that she had to do almost 2,000 years ago? Keep reading.
Grinding, baking, washing, cooking, nursing her child, preparing his bed, and working in wool. Right.
So those were the standard activities that were expected. Now, there's also a discussion in other texts about other minor household chores, but these are the main things that one would expect. Grinding is, of course, milling the wheat. Remember, when wheat comes out of the ground, it doesn't come out as a loaf of bread. It comes out as little seeds. You got to grind it up into the flour. You probably think of big windmills. Most people didn't have windmills in their backyard. They had two stones that they would grind on top of each other, a little hand mill maybe, to make their own flour. So you make your own flour, do their own baking, you do the washing, you do the cooking, you nurse her child. Why is nurse her child?
There's multiple wives.
Because there might be multiple wives or successive wives. So imagine the first wife had died giving birth to a child. There is now a baby. The man remarries. He cannot force the new wife, even if she is lactating, to nurse someone else's wife, right? Someone else's baby. Thank you. He would have to hire a wet nurse. He would have to pay for someone to be the wet nurse for that other child. Now, would she? Could she? Of course she can. But this is talking about obligation. Always bears repeating. Remember, by the time we get to looking at the precise law, it means something has gone horribly wrong in the relationship. If there are questions about whether a person is really pulling their weight and doing the right thing, then you end up at the court. But ideally, you avoid those kinds of questions by having, conversations, discussions, working things out in the relationship. This is only for the emergency solution to problems. Preparing his bed and working in wool. These were sort of the standard things that would be expected of a wife. Now, notice you can't make her pull a plow. He can't sell her to someone else to do work for someone else. He can't expect her to go out and hunt down elephants. Right? This is not only the minimum that's expected from her, it's also the maximum he can demand from her. And that's important, because if she fails to do her work, then he can divorce her and he doesn't have to pay her the Ketubot settlement. He doesn't have to pay her that stipend. Because if she's just not working, then, we're going to starve. And I shouldn't have to pay money to somebody who was attempting to starve the family. Again, ancient households, this wasn't just a unit for living happily and comfortably together. This was a unit for surviving.
he doesn't have to pay the Ketubot settlement, or they subtract from the Ketubot settlement?
We'll get there. We'll get there, right? We're talking about if there is no solution to her refusal to work, that he ends up paying her zero, right? We're going to talk about steps that can try to change a person who doesn't want to contribute to the house to a person who does, but we're not there yet. One step at a time. You were reading ahead again. So this is the basic requirement that both sides need to understand.
What about if she wanted, but she's not good in cooking, or she's not good in something else, but she can do the rest?
So in a family, what they would do would we'd work that out to figure out what's right, what's wrong, what can she, I don't want to eat her cooking because it's terrible, but they would need to find a way for the cooking to get done. Because of the way the physical work was usually structured, it was often impractical to expect that the husband would be the one cooking, because cooking took a long time. Right? Cooking wasn't, throw it in the microwave. Cooking wasn't even with a simple oven like we have nowadays. It was a harder process to get the fire going, tend the fire, and all of that. So cooking did tend to limit a person to often spending more time around the cooking area and near the house. You didn't usually cook in your house. That was just a good way to kill yourself, both from the fumes as well as from burning down your home. So you'd cook in the courtyard area. That meant a person was usually tied to that area for more of the day than a person who wasn't cooking. And that meant the person who had more of the physical effort that could help in other parts of the land use wasn't the person expected to cook. Now, if the family can't afford someone to take care of the cooking, and she doesn't have some other great skill that they can sell that can hire a cook to take care of the cooking, then she's going to have to learn how to cook.
What about if she has a handicap or something like that? I mean, things can happen. And she could do some of the things and some she couldn't.
Right. So if a person is absolutely handicapped, disabled, or otherwise incapable of doing certain jobs, tasks, or other things, then there can be stipulations when they get married that say, she doesn't have to do these things. That's an agreement they can reach before they get married. Once they get married, and this is going to sound harsh, if she suddenly can't do the job, he is allowed to divorce her. Right? Again, there would be a settlement in that case because it's not her fault that she can't do the job. Someone cuts off her hands. But he would technically, when she was healed and well, be allowed to divorce her. Doesn't mean it's recommended. Right? Just like in the modern American system, if God forbid your loved one and spouse were injured in a car crash, the government wouldn't tell you you're not allowed to divorce them, but your friends and family would say, that's cold, right? That's mean. And so too in the ancient world. So the law didn't forbid it, but your community would certainly look at you very differently if you were behaving in that heartless manner. All right. But there are other ways that she can avoid doing work. Part 2.
If she brought one slave woman into the marriage, she need not grind or bake or wash.
Right. So if her family, when she was getting married, gave her a indentured servant, somebody who would be the bondswoman, or other ways of trying to soften this phrase slave woman, which of course in American history has a very different style of slavery than the ancient world's history. If she brought this as part of the contribution, he, the husband, wasn't allowed to then use that bondswoman however he felt like. That bondswoman was designated for doing certain tasks, and there was a hierarchy of what tasks this servant would take first from off the plate of the wife. Right. So the first things that would go would be that she wouldn't have to do the grinding, the baking, or the washing, and those were considered to be the hardest of the jobs. So those would be the ones that you would want to hand off if you could. Part A.
If she brought 2 slave women, she not cook or nurse her child.
Right. So one of them is going to do the grinding, the baking, the washing, and one of them is going to do the cooking and the nursing. And yes, using wet nurses was not uncommon. Using wet nurses often was essential. Lactation is not as automatic as some people seem to think it is. And definitely in a pre-modern society, when people were often subsistence farmers, there were many reasons why a woman would not be able to lactate reliably. And if you can't, then your child will die. So having somebody who can give that service was often important in the ancient world. Once again, how happy we are to be living in the 21st century. Part C, or part B.
Yeah. If 3, she need not prepare his bed or work in wool.
Right, let someone else do the spinning. Let someone else do the bed preparation. And then C.
If 4, she may lounge in an easy chair.
Okay, now, if you are reading very, very carefully between the lines, there's a question that happens between part B and C. So if he has 1, then she doesn't have to worry about grinding, baking, or washing, right? Cross those off the list. If she has 2, she doesn't have to worry about the bed or the wool. If she has 2, she doesn't need to worry about cooking and nursing. Cross those off the list. If she has 3, she doesn't have to prepare his bed or work in wool. Cross those off the list. What's left on the list at that point? Nothing. So why does it take 4 before she's reclining? If we finish all of her jobs with 3, why does it take 4 before she gets to go to the lazy boy? And the idea is that there were other incidental activities that would also be expected, that were minor household chores. But with 1 more person, then yeah, definitely those can be taken care of. And now she's got nothing to do. Literally, she has no obligation to do anything. Does that mean she can't? Of course she can do more work and she can do other ways to help the household. But the husband can't force her to do more. That's what we're arguing about here, is whether or not he can say she is being derelict in her duties. Hey, if she brought 4 slaves into this marriage and they're taking care of all of the work, she is allowed to sit in a hammock, and the husband can't be mad about that. Well, he can be mad, but he can't take her to court over that. Let's be precise. However, the rabbis are going to be not happy with that outcome. So they're going to try and tweak that answer a little bit. Onward.
Rabbi Eliezer says, even if she brought him 100 slave women, he may compel her to work in wool, for idleness leads to unchastity.
All right, so Rabbi Eliezer says, no. She's got to have at least something to do. Because if she's sitting in the hammock all day, that is a recipe for disaster. It's what was the term in the American idiom? Idle hands are the devil's plaything, right? You guys never heard that phrase? So I'm almost positive, and if anyone's watching online, they can correct me. The phrase pretty much goes with idle hands are the devil's playthings, or idle hands are the devil's playground, which basically means if you're not using your hands, if you're not working, then you're going to get up to no good. My grandmother, may she rest in peace, used to always say it a little differently. She used to say, if you're not back by 11 o'clock, every place that you can go legitimately is closed, which means you're making your own fun. Right? So you got no business out after 11. Because once everything that you could go to, this is when I'm in high school, once everything you could go to is closed, you should come home. Because if you're not home, you're going to be inventing new activities that are going to get you into trouble, right? You're going to be looking for fun and making your own fun, and that is not going to be good. It's one thing, yeah, go to a movie, sure, no problem. In her mind, movies all finished by 11, but then she was right, to be honest, that if there was nothing to entertain you out there, then you're going to entertain yourself. And if there's nothing to keep you busy, you're going to find other ways to spend your time. And he was particularly worried about one form of spending your time, which was to make goo-goo eyes at other guys, to begin to fool around with other men, because you didn't even have one thing to occupy you on behalf of your house. If you don't have some, what's the phrase they use, skin in the game, if you're not involved at all in your own personal efforts to make your house, make your family, then it's much easier to feel less connected to your family and your spouse, and to just think about having fun. And you know what? He looks like fun. That's a problem. Make sense? Okay. Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel has a different twist.
If a man forbade his wife under a vow to do any work, he must divorce her and give her
Ketubot.
for her idleness leads to insanity.
Okay, so Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel looks at it from a different direction. He says, not what if she brought 100 servants, but what if her husband said, I swear before God, or other formulas of vowing, you'll never have to do a day's work in your life. Now, you might think, wow, what a great husband. That is so nice that he is forbidding her from having to do work, because a vow is the ultimate level of commitment. It is not just a statement of, I hope. It is inviolate. But that means she can't work, right? Not just that she doesn't have to. If he makes a vow forbidding her from working, then that vow becomes binding. And now it's not just that she has the option of luxury, she is forced to not work. And Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel says, if you don't let a person work, if you don't let a person be active, they will go crazy. I know we may imagine that a life of idleness, of just sitting around and doing whatever we felt like without having to worry about doing any work at all, sounds a bit like a dream. He was really worried, and I think with good understanding of human psychology, that if you forbid a person from doing any meaningful work, any labor that had value and worth at all, the person would go crazy. Now, not necessarily crazy like, locked up in a rubber room crazy, but it would be mental anguish. Right? That's the road for depression. That's a road for other forms of mental illness, to be deprived of having any activity that has worth. And so, even though she is now technically lazy because she's doing no work, her husband has to divorce her and has to give her the settlement because it was his stupid vow that put her in that position, and we're not going to leave her there to suffer this mental illness that will eventually descend upon her because of his promise. Does that make sense? So, hopefully you're seeing that this is saying a lot about the value of work. Right? Judaism believes that having a meaningful form of work in your life is an important part of your psychological health. That sitting home and just playing video games, unless you're like a video game, competitor, and do that as your profession, that's not going to be fulfilling. Just sitting home, rolling through Facebook, unless you're a social media account manager, not going to make a fulfilling life. And you may feel okay for a while. It may even feel good for, a couple months. Eventually, your spirit is going to want you to do something worthwhile. And, hopefully you'll find a way to do that. Okay. Any questions on 5.5? Okay. 5.6.
A man forbade himself by vow from having intercourse with his wife.
Okay.
They changed that word, right? Because before they were using the word relations, right?
It's a euphemism. Yes.
All right.
We're all adults. We can even say the word sex. Shorter, so it takes less time. So we just talked about a silly vow at the end of the last Mishnah. So it's not surprising as the Mishnah progresses to talk about a different silly vow. Now, what's the vow here? The vow is the man is saying, I will not have sex with you. Right? Well, that's a problem. Right? Because Judaism believes, based on the book of Exodus, that a man has an obligation to have relations with his wife. That is, in fact, part of her due from him. Right? He is obligated to provide her with upkeep and with intimacy. Both are part of his duties to her. I know most of us are from Western European cultures where the idea that a woman might actually want to have relations is considered, oh no, women aren't supposed to do that. It's Puritans and all of those, Protestant, we're not supposed to talk Victorian, put skirts on pianos and say white meat and dark meat rather than thighs and breast, because otherwise it's too sexual. Literally, that's why people say white meat and dark meat. Because they didn't want to say, please pass me a breast at the table, or please pass me a thigh, because you shouldn't talk about that at tables. Crazy stuff that went on. And many people still have this feeling that sex is primarily a male preoccupation. Most people know that that's not true, but when it comes time to talk about it, it's usually framed as though only wicked women actually want to have sex. Man always wants it more than she does. And that is simply not true. People are individuals, and different people have different levels of need, if you will. But the Torah is telling us that part of a woman's needs is to have intimacy. And if she is married to a man, part of his duties to her is to be available to help with that need. Making sense so far? I'll just make sure that we understand as well that this is especially relevant in the ancient world when polygamy was still possible. It would be very, very possible to imagine, and indeed in many parts of the world, if this did happen, for a man to marry two women, one of whom was the worker and one of whom was for the bedroom. And the bedroom one was often spared, often a lot of the work and toil that might diminish her beauty. And the other one was never given intimacy at all. She was still commanded to remain chaste to her husband. She couldn't go out and have intimacy with anyone else, of course. That would be considered adultery. But you ended up with this two very different statuses within a household. And the Torah is saying, no, right? You're married to multiple women. Each of them also gets their due in all sense of that word. You're not allowed to say, you work, you're in the bedroom, you I won't sleep with, you I will. No. I'm going to be sleeping with you, and I'm going to be sleeping with you. Even if I'd rather be with you, I still also have to be with her because I'm married to her. It's my obligation. Yeah. It's also one reason why we don't do polygamy nowadays. It's just generally wasn't recommended even in the ancient world, but for a long time it's been actively forbidden in Judaism. But at the time of the Mishnah, it was still permitted technically. Again, not recommended, but technically it was still permitted. All right, so a man forbade himself from having intercourse with his wife. What time period are we talking? What would a vow like that look like? There's a debate.
Beit Shammai says 2 weeks. Beit Hillel says 1 week.
Okay, so what does it count to forbid yourself from your having relations with your wife to a point that is significant enough to be a charge leveled against the husband, where the court would actually force him to divorce her? And that's what we're actually talking about here, is if he says, I vow not to have sex with you ever again, she can go straight to the court, and the court can tell him, you must divorce her and you must pay her the ketubot, you must pay her the stipend. But if he says, I vow not to have sex with you for 2 weeks, is that enough for her to get the court to force him to divorce her? Or if he says, I vow not to have sex with you for 1 week, is that enough for her to go to the court to force him to divorce her? Yes?
The way I read this was, I thought if he said, I vow not to have sex with you ever again, he has a week to annul his vow.
So there are ways to annul vows, yes. But the question here is, what counts as a significant enough delay? And that would be equal to forever, right? I know we might say, well, 2 weeks, 3 weeks. I mean, come on, that's not that bad. Right? But the argument here isn't whether or not they can or can't. Again, nothing's here to say that the husbands and wives have to have sex this frequently. It's just saying if she were to demand it, he would have to provide it with a certain frequency. And the argument here is whether 2 weeks or 1 week is a sufficiently lengthy period of time under this kind of setting with a vow for her to complain.
So if he says never again, she can divorce him the next day?
Yeah. She can force the court to force him to divorce her. But if he were to say, no, I would rather annul my vow, then they can annul the vow instead.
He doesn't have 1 week to annul it then?
He doesn't get to sit on it, right? So the question of taking time to gather people together to annul the vow, that's one thing. If you're taking steps to fix the situation. But if he's like, I'll annul it at the end of the week, right? If he's toying with her, even though he said, I'm going to never have sex with you again, that is where there's a problem. And you're not allowed to manipulate the court system to cause pain to your spouse. Right? That's just really something that the rabbis frowned upon, of deliberately misusing how the courts worked for twisting the knife in someone else. So here the question is, why 1 week versus 2 weeks? What are they arguing about? Well, 2 weeks is the maximum Torah prohibition on intercourse at any point. After a woman has given birth to a girl, there is a mandatory 2-week waiting period before relations can resume. And so that's where Beit Shammai is saying. It's like, look, if the Torah says that at least sometimes you have to wait 2 weeks before you're together again, then 2 weeks should be our minimum before we get involved. Whereas Beit Hillel is saying no, because it shouldn't be about the unusual circumstance of just 50% of births that result in this. It should instead be the more common case, which is how often does the Torah say that a family should refrain from being together intimately, and that is 1 week during the period of Nida, the monthly cycle of separation. So since the Torah only says stay apart for 1 week during Nida, then 1 week should be the only length of time that we can reasonably expect her to have to put up with this kind of nonsense, because that's a fairly standard form of separation that does happen at least once a month. So you're about to ask a question, or are you ready to read the next?
I'm ready to read the next.
Okay, part 2.
Students may go away to study Torah without the permission of their wives for a period of 30 days, workers for 1 week.
Okay, so before we get into the details, just notice the wonderful word here, permission. I say to my wife, I want to go to Israel to study. I'll be back in 6 months. Now, I'm the husband. I own the land. I am the master of the house. She can tell me, no, you're not. You're not going for 6 months. You can go for 30 days without getting my permission. But if I tell you that you need to be back in 31 days, you have to be back in 31 days because you owe me your physical presence. You owe me intimacy. That is my due. Right? That is your debt to me as being husband and wife. So you can't just go off for a month without getting my consent. Now, if the wife is agreeable and says, of course, you can go and study for 6 months, that'd be wonderful. Torah is lovely, Israel is lovely, see you in 6 months, then that's fine. Everything is agreed. But he has to get her permission before he can go.
If she says no, can he force her to go with him?
No. The workers for 1 week is the question of, guy says, hey, I'm normally a construction worker here in Orlando, but I got an opportunity to go down to Miami and do some building. I'll be gone for 2 weeks. See ya. And she's allowed to stop him. The Torah student gets more time because Torah is, wonderful. But the worker who is normally at home is not allowed to disappear for a week, more than a week, without his wife's permission, because if he does, she will be deprived of his physical presence. And that intimacy is his responsibility to provide.
All right. I have a question actually about the first one. Who won between Shammai and Hillel?
Hillel.
Hillel won?
Yeah, in almost all circumstances, Beit Hillel wins. Okay, so that's our basic argument. But from that, we're now going to get into a little more detail of the different measures that would be expected of a husband in different times. So we're now in part 3.
The times for conjugal duty prescribed in the Torah are A, for independent men every day.
So if independent men, probably a better term in modern language would be a man of means. So he doesn't have to work. He's independently wealthy. He's the hedge fund broker. So he does 20 minutes of work on the phone, and the rest of the day is his own. Somebody like that, any day his wife says, I would like to be with you, he has to be willing to respond yes. He can't claim, I've got a headache, I'm tired, I'm busy, right? Because he's not. He's not tired. He's not busy because he doesn't work. No offense to hedge fund brokers. We appreciate you and your donations. It's just that you do not have a physical reason why you can't be with me, would be his wife's response. Because of your work is not the kind that exhausts the body. I know for many people who work in non-physical labor, it may come as a surprise, but a full day of working in construction, a full day of working in heavy machinery or farming can absolutely make a person not have enough energy for intimacy when they are at home that night. So having no physical demanding job means that you should be more readily available for your spouse. Onward.
For workers, twice a week.
Right, so that's just sort of your general run-of-the-mill workers. You should be able to have the energy and willingness to be with your wife twice a week. Right? If it's less than that, she has a legitimate grievance against you, because it isn't your work that's preventing you from being with her. It's you that's preventing you from being with her. And you owe her intimacy as often as your work and your body's health will allow.
For donkey drivers, once a week.
So donkey drivers were sort of the short-haul truckers of the ancient world. They would take things from one town to the next. But the donkeys were sort of in a short-range transportation. But part D.
For camel drivers, once in 30 days.
Obviously, long-range truckers are not going to be coming home even once a week. They're going to be gone for like a month at a time. Now, she knows that this is his job, so it's not a surprise to her. We'll talk later about if he wants to change his job with or without her permission. But now we're just setting some baselines. And then?
For sailors, once in 6 months.
Okay. If you're a sailor, again, this is pre-modern world, you would disappear for months at a time. But she did get to say, I need to see you at least twice a year for this to still be considered you taking care of me in all ways. And if you're going to be gone more than that, then just divorce me now so I can remarry someone else, because otherwise it's just not fair. All right, any questions on this? Does it seem surprising that the Mishnah is focusing on her rights, her needs for sexual intimacy?
It's in the Torah.
It's in the Torah, exactly. But a lot of people skip those words. Because a lot of people, when they read the Torah, or even when they read rabbinic literature, read it with a modern lens. And that often leads to misunderstanding. In this particular case, I think for many people, it's led to the misunderstanding that the Torah was very much about a pro-intimacy book. Right? The Tanakh in general has a fond opinion of the intimacy that happens between husbands and wives, right? If you're married together with a loving partner, being intimate together is something that both of you deserve and something that both of you should enjoy. And if there's something in the workplace that's messing that up, it needs to be addressed. You can't just say, deal with it, because both people have a right to be able to have a good physical relationship with each other. Good? Good. All right, onward, 5-7. Now things get messy.
Wait. Okay. Mishnah 7. If a wife rebels against her husband, her ketubah is reduced by 7 denarii a week.
Okay, excuse me. Okay, so now we get back to what Aaron was asking about earlier. You have a family, and there's something going wrong. And the woman is just refusing to work, right? She's not spinning the wool, she's not cooking, she's not baking, she's doing no work in the household. And she doesn't have a bunch of servants doing the work instead. And so the husband goes to the court and says, look, what am I supposed to do? She's not working. I don't want to divorce her, because if I divorce her now, then I'll have to pay her the ketubah settlement. I'd rather she worked. Remember, the ketubah amount was substantial. That was the point, was that it would be enough for a woman to live on for a considerable length of time. And so the court would say, okay, well, investigate. They indeed find that she's not working. She would be brought before the court, and they would say, look, this is what's going to happen. For every day you don't work, your ketubah, the amount that the husband would have to pay you upon divorce, is going to be reduced by a certain amount, essentially garnishing her wages, if you will. Right? You're going to get docked pay if you refuse to do the work you're supposed to do. Which I imagine for anyone here who's ever had a job would make sense. Right? You show up at the office and you refuse to do work. You shouldn't be surprised if your boss doesn't want to pay you for that day's employment. Now, there's a debate here about whether or not it would be by 7 denarii or whether it be reduced by 7 tropaics. Right now, the tropaic, I think, is half of a denarii. So the idea here is basically half of the other. It's either a minimum amount or a minimum minimum amount. It's not a huge amount. It's not like it's going to zero out her ketubah in a week. It would still take a long time. I don't know the exact math because that's not my strong suit, but it would take some time before the ketubah got zeroed out. And that would give her time to say, okay, right, bad, whatever my problems are with my husband, we need to actually work them out while I'm still helping the household, because marriage isn't just about personalities, marriage is also about survival. And if you're going to survive, well, we're both in this together, and we need to actually survive first before we can argue out the rest of our relationship.
So if she's doing everything but cooking, it's still 7 denarii for the week?
If she is...
Versus somebody who does nothing at all?
If she is... so the court can adjust if necessary, but the idea here is one not of just error or problems. This is a question of outright rebelliousness. I'm refusing to do anything for him. I'm refusing to work for him, which you can imagine in some relationships happening. It's not just a question of, I broke my hip and so I can't cook for him today, or there's no water in the well so I can't do the washing. It's not a question of, how much of it. So the husband wouldn't be allowed to nickel and dime her every time something went wrong from her ketubah. So it's not exactly, and the court would be allowed to assign a fair value if she was doing some of the work, but not all of it. But in most of these cases, it was blanket, I'm refusing to work because I'm upset, right? Because I'm angry, because there's something wrong in our relationship, and I am going on strike. It's the same thing that modern workers would do if they were upset with how the relationship between them and management was happening. Good? Good. All right. So, part 2.
Part 2. How long does he continue to reduce? A, until the amount of her ketubah.
Right. So basically, the question is, how long does this go on? Right. Can't he just divorce her in some other way? And the answer is no. You have to let her go through her entire ketubah, and that could be a long period of her not doing any work. On the other hand, as she refuses to work, it is reducing his liability to her when he does finally divorce her. Okay, then part B.
Rabbi Yosef say he may continue to reduce, and if she receives an inheritance, he may collect from it.
Okay, so Rabbi Yossi is even both more strict and more lenient in this process. So he says, look, once you get the ketubah down to 0, the husband could divorce her, but if gets her to 0 and she receives a gift from another family, from an inheritance or something like that, that is hers, that can also be docked from her wages. So the husband could actually also take that in this process of punishment. Now, Rabbi Yossi loses this argument, but he's trying to say that her husband has the right to take anything that is hers in order to compel her to live up to her side of the bargain. The court says, no, the ketubah that was promised, that is the maximum that can be zeroed out in this form of encouraging her to stop rebelling against the work, to go back to break the strike. Make sense? Okay, part 3.
Similarly, if a husband rebels against his wife, an addition of 3 denarii a week is made to her ketubah.
Okay, so if he rebels against her, meaning he's refusing to take care of her in any of the ways, whether it be providing her with her food, providing her with clothing, or providing her with intimacy, then she as well gains in her ketubah, right? The amount that he will owe her when or if he finally divorces her, which remember, if he's refusing to provide for her, the court can force him to divorce her and let her collect. Once she solicits that response from them, that amount that the court will force him to pay will continue to rise for as long as he refuses to take care of her the way he is supposed to.
Okay. The Jubilee would wipe out any debt owed through the ketubah, right?
No,
if they divorced and he owed her money from the ketubah, would that pass through the year of the Jubilee?
It's not a question of what it once you divorce, the ketubah is collected immediately. It is the number one debt of all other debts that has to be settled at the moment that the ketubah is handed over.
Right. If he doesn't have enough to settle the debt, though, it would.
Then his property would be sold until he did.
I mean, you would get it back after the jubilee, though, right?
So depending upon the property, right? You sell my donkey, I don't get my donkey back. You sell my land property, that would return. Yes. If I have a fancy ring, then that would be sold and gone forever. Okay, good. 5-8. And I think we're back around the table. Got another good long one.
If a man provides for his wife through an agent, he must give her every week no less than 2 kabin of wheat or 4 kabin of barley.
Okay, so if you've got what we would probably call not a great relationship going on here, or maybe the man is a sailor or someone else who travels frequently, and that means he has left the money to manage the household with an agent, with some other representative. Yes, they didn't have joint bank accounts back then, and depending upon the relationship, he might not leave it with her automatically. He might. That's perfectly fine and was not uncommon at all. But let's imagine that he doesn't, says the Mishnah. Let's instead imagine that he has his brother or his father or someone else take care of the household funds and have to provide for her then while he's gone in his absence. How much does that person have to give her? Right? There may be other obligations for the household, but what does her own portion come to? And the idea is 2 kabin of wheat or 4 kabin of barley. It's a good reminder, as hopefully everyone here has learned, which is wheat is better than barley. I know health people, health nuts and all of that, love barley and all of that, and that's great when we are lovely, plump Westerners and can afford to waste our time eating less efficient grains. But in the ancient world, wheat was king because wheat meant more calories for the amount of work you spent growing it. So wheat better than barley, therefore you only get less, you get less wheat than barley, and you will still die, still not die. This is your making sure you meet in the your minimum calorie count. Again, in the modern world, we worry about having too many calories each day. In the old world, they worried about not having enough calories each day. Onward.
Rabbi Yosef said only Rabbi Ishmael, who lived near Edom, granted her a supply of barley.
Really, barley wasn't actually an appropriate substitute for wheat. It should be wheat, is his argument. The only reason why barley was allowed was because in near Edom, barley was the main crop. And therefore, it made sense since it was more plentiful. That was the natural food of people who lived in that area. Part B.
You must also give her half a cob of pulse and half a log of oil, and the cob of dried figs, or a manet of pressed figs. And if he has no such fruit, he must supply her with a corresponding quantity of other fruits.
Okay, so again, minimum balanced diet. You've got to have a little bit of fruit. You've got to have a little bit of oil. This is talking about olive oil. You've got to have a little bit of pulse. This is another type of grain that goes along with it, sort of as your veg. This is a minimum amount of food. Now, this is not exactly what you would call luxury feast, but this is the minimum that would be required. If it's less than this, then she absolutely has grounds to take him to court and either have him increase or force him to divorce her and pay the ketubah. If he wants to give her more, absolutely no problem with that. And if you can afford it, it would even be best. But this is the minimum. Onward.
You must also provide her with a bed, a mattress, and a mat.
Okay, again, you might think, that's it. This is the minimum. Of course, we would hope that he would provide her with more, but if he provided her with less, she would have grounds for complaint to the court. Part 3.
He must also give her a hat for her head and a girdle for her loins, shoes from festival to festival, and clothing worth 50 zuz every year.
All right, so clothing or shoes from festival to festival is a very interesting image. The idea, of course, is that Shalosh Regalim, for the 3 festivals, they are pilgrimage festivals, which means we're walking to Jerusalem. Most people didn't get to ride. And that meant that you might expect that your shoes would wear out every few months, both from normal usage as well as from the pilgrimage festival. So you did want to have new shoes more often, perhaps even than we do, of course. Most of us are not great pedestrians either. We don't probably walk nearly as many steps. They didn't need to worry about having step counters back then. Basic clothing, basic girdle and hat, these are sort of the standard around the midsection, and a hat for your head. That, yes, was required. If you didn't want to give her a hat, the court could say, man, you got to give her a hat. Good? Good. Part A.
She is not to be given new clothes in the summer or worn out clothes in the winter, but must be given clothes worth 50 zuz during the winter, and she wears them when they are worn out during the summer, and the worn out clothes remain her property.
All right, so we get down to brass tacks in that last line, but let's make sure we understand what they're arguing about here with the winter-summer clothing. I hope that most of you have more than one piece of clothing in your wardrobe. When you open up the closet, there's probably more than one thing hanging there. In the ancient world, you were usually wearing what you owned. You didn't have a closet, unless you were very wealthy. For the average person, you would get a new set of clothes, maybe twice a year, and that's why the minimum set here is once a year, you're getting new sets of clothes. But the argument is, if I give you new clothes in the summer, what state are they going to be in by the time winter comes around? They're going to be worn out. They're going to have holes, right? And as much as everybody always wants to make it look like Israel is a complete desert and always hot, it gets cold. It gets cold in Israel. And if my clothes are worn out in the winter, and you say, hey, you can't complain, I gave you clothes in the summer, then that's not fair. Because now she is left with threadbare clothing when she needs clothing that will keep her warm most. So instead, it's a great example that you can do what's right in two different ways, and one of which is right and the other is wrong. I gave her 50 zuz of clothes, yeah, but you gave it to her in the summer, so by the time winter came around, she was suffering. So instead, you have to give her in the winter, and then in the summer, it's worn out, and okay, fine, it's going to be a little light and breezy, but it's summer. Light and breezy is okay in the summer. And then that last little brass tacks line, what do we do with the leftover clothes, right? She's worn out a pair of clothes. He's given her a new set. And you can imagine, in a bad relationship, him saying, all right, I want the old clothes because I'm going to go sell those. And she is allowed to say, no, these belong to me. Again, not an example of a good relationship, not an example of what should be a relationship. It's just an example of how the court would handle this relationship if it came to that. Good? Good. The same way, by the way, if this is too depressing to read, if you read through if you read through the list of American laws, you would also think that everybody was horrible. If somebody murders, if somebody steals, if someone kidnaps, it's like, no, these are extreme cases, right? This is what it means to kidnap. This is what it means to murder. It doesn't mean that these things are happening often. It doesn't mean that we recommend that they happen often, God forbid. It just means this is what we do when it happens. Good? Good. So I don't want you to think that all the relationships were this bad. I believe, Aaron, it's up to you.
Mishnah, are we on 5:8?
We are on 5:9, I thought. Didn't we just finish 5:8? Yeah.
You must also give her every week a silver ma'ah or ma'ah for her other needs, and she is to eat with him every Friday Eve.
All right, so he has to give her enough spending money to take care of everything else. So she's got her basic food, she's got her clothing, she's got her basic, bed, mattress, all that stuff, and he has to give her a little pocket money, money to take care of her other needs. And remember, this is all for when she doesn't live with him, and she's being taken care of by some go-between. However, notice at the end, every Shabbat for Friday night, he does have to invite her to his table. He is not allowed to treat her entirely as though she were some stranger. In addition to the physical intimacy that he owes her, he does also have to give her some company when it comes time for Shabbat. And it also means that she has to be eating what he eats when it comes to Shabbat, which was usually the nicest meal of the week.
So if he has more than one wife, what happens?
Then you have a lovely crowded table.
Oh. If he does not give her a silver ma'ah for her other needs, her handiwork belongs to her.
Remember, we talked about that way near the beginning of chapter 5, that if he refuses to support her economically or simply can't, then all of those 7 labors that she does, she's allowed to keep them for herself, and she's allowed to sell them in order to provide for herself. Right? So she's doing her weaving, she's doing anything else, that becomes her own property to then sell on the marketplace. Part 3.
And what is the quantity of work that she must do for him?
Remember, we talked about this whole wool and everything else, but if I spin 3 threads, does that count as enough? Okay.
The weight of 5 selim of warp in Judea, which amounts to 10 selim in Galilee, or the weight of 10 selim of wool in Judea, which amounts to 20 selim in Galilee. Galilee. If she was nursing, her handiwork is reduced and her maintenance is increased.
Okay, so the first part of that sentence is simply letting us know that between Judea and Galilee, between the middle of Israel and the north of Israel, they had a different measuring system for their wool. And there's the same amount, it's just different ways of counting depending upon where you lived. It's sort of like in America, if you were to say, this is 1 kilogram and this is, 2 point something pounds. Right? It's the same, it's just different numbers for a different way of measuring it. And then, of course, the second half is the logical extension of what it means to take care of someone. If she's nursing, she is not going to be as capable of producing as much work because she will be spending so much time taking care of the child. And therefore, she cannot be expected to produce as much. And more than that, she's going to need more support in order for her to take care of the child. And so the maintenance that she receives actually goes up. So her productivity goes down in terms of the products, and her expenses go up, and he is expected to pick up that bill. Make sense? Yeah, it is very reasonable. 4.
All this applies to a poor person in Israel, but in the case of a more respectable husband, all is fixed according to his dignity.
Okay, which is a great way to finish the chapter and the evening, which is to say, this is the minimum for minimum people. But if he's Bill Gates and his wife is not living with him, he's not allowed to treat her with the minimum because he's a billionaire. There's no reason why he shouldn't be taking care of her better. And if he is, driving fancy cars, if he is living in a fancy house, then she has to be provided in a comparable manner. Doesn't mean she has to be given everything. It doesn't even mean she has to be given half, but it does mean that she needs to be living in a lifestyle that is comparable to her husband's, even if they're not living together. If they are living together, then all the more so, and it's a little bit easier because they're sharing a house. But even if they're not living together, he can't just keep her as some poor person in a shack somewhere, with a mattress, mat, and pad. He actually has to provide her with something that is roughly equivalent to what he provides for himself. So if you marry someone who has greater means, you do have a right to enjoy the means that that person has. Make sense? I know, it's so logical. Unfortunately, remember, not everyone thinks it's logical, which is why it has to be spelled out in the law so that when couples come and complain before the court, an answer can be given that is correct. All right, any other questions tonight? Then chapter 6 next week.